Next, we're going to move on to the unofficial roles of the president. These are roles that are not clearly explained or defined in the Constitution, but are things that the president is responsible for doing. These unofficial roles fall into three categories: the head of state, the head of the party, and the leader of the free world. Now, on your notes, you need to, as I talk about these individually in some depth, you need to define or, kind of explain what each one of these roles is, as well as some examples that I provide throughout this lesson. So the first one we're going to talk about in depth is the head of state. So the head of state is a role that many countries have a different person fulfill these duties outside of the chief executive that we talked about earlier in these notes, or the head of the government. So think King Charles, or more famously, Queen Elizabeth II. Everyone knew who Queen Elizabeth was and that she was the Queen of England, but not many people could pick out who the Prime Minister of Great Britain was, right? So the Queen is this head of state. It's the figurehead or the face of the country. So one of the more not so serious traditions the president of our country, because he holds this role as well, fulfills is like the master of ceremonies of the White House Easter egg roll. So the head of state is a USA embodiment. Like, they are embodying the United States, the face of the United States. They are the head of the PR. Like, they're trying to put out good press on the United States through the various actions that they do. And then obviously the master of ceremonies, which is what President Trump is doing in this picture for the White House Easter egg roll hunt in 2019. Another example of being head of state is attending funerals of foreign leaders, or even weddings of foreign leaders, or future foreign leaders. So in this picture, it is President Biden and Dr. Biden attending the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. Now, because the Queen was the head of state for England, the United States representative for that event is going to be the president. If it was a lesser figure, say the Prime Minister in this case, then it would be a lower ranked individual within our government. It might be an ambassador, it could be the vice president, depending on who it is. So the president comes for those actual main people. So the president would attend, say, the future King of England, say Prince William. When he got married, the president showed up for that wedding because he is the future leader or the future head of state of that country. Another example of the head of state here is the president throwing out the ceremonial first pitch on the opening day of the World Series. This picture is George W. Bush in 2001, post 9/11, which was a big morale booster for the country to see the president throw out this first pitch. The president can also host black tie state dinners at the White House for foreign leaders. So anytime a foreign leader comes to visit, they will do a black tie event. Everyone will get very dressed up. This is a black tie event for Obama's state dinner with the Prime Minister of Italy in 2016. But they're ultra fancy receptions for foreign dignitaries. Another example of the last example I want to give you for head of state would be the president awarding the highest civilian awards, so like the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So, and this is a tradition started by President Kennedy to celebrate lifetime achievements in the arts, sciences, and diplomacy. So this is the official criteria for this is an especially meritorious contribution to the security or national interest of the United States, world peace, culture, and or other significant events of the private endeavors. So very clearly, it's one of the highest awards one can earn in the United States as a civilian. So the highest level you could earn in the military would be the Medal of Honor. This is kind of the equivalent to that kind of honor, just on the civilian side. The president can award it to whomever they like and in whatever manner they like. So some presidents award them, a few dozen at once in the White House ceremony. This is what President Obama and Biden have done, while others award it one at a time, which is what President Trump did in his first term. Now, moving on to the next unofficial role would be the head of party. The president is naturally their party's default leader while in office. So this is going to be the leader of the office. They campaign for and endorse candidates and appoints leaders of party's national committee. So really what the president really drives what the party itself is going to focus on and how they're going to do it. So, being the highest ranking elected official, the president is the leader of their party. The president can do political activities while in office. There's no rules against that. Other elected officials get limited in how they do their political activities because of the Hatch Act. If they are acting on behalf of their official role, then they can't do campaigns. But the president and the vice president are outside the scope of that. So President Trump took an unprecedented step in this role by holding political rally-like events after assuming the office, which was a change in how the president kind of handled those political events while in office. There are strict guidelines on what counts as campaigning for oneself or on behalf of others, and serving out the duties of the president. So these rallies received criticism for blurring that line and trying to figure out who was going to pay for what, who was incurring the cost of such things and whatnot. So this is a picture of President Trump in his first term, along with First Lady Melania, in Youngstown, Ohio. The president can also campaign for other candidates of their party. So we saw when Joe Biden ran for office in 2020, Obama was out on the campaign trail with him. He also did some campaigning for him when he ran again in 2024. And sometimes they will hit the campaign trail, both the president and former president or vice president will hit the campaign trail in a midterm election, that election that happens in the midway point of a presidential term. So to try to help get others in their party elected to help support the agenda for the president. This role only works in this way if the candidate wants the president to be there. So if the candidate is not really necessarily aligned 100% with the president, or the president is not having the best approval ratings, then the candidate's not going to want the president on the campaign trail with them. The last unofficial role will be the leader of the free world. So this is kind of the last unofficial hat that the president wears. This title was coined after World War II, has fallen out of use in the media since George H.W. Bush, so late 80s, early 90s, especially as other nations are rising as influential world leaders. This is going to be Germany, this is going to be Japan, but the United States is still most definitely a world leader. And here we are, this image is President Biden visiting Kiev, Ukraine, and meeting with the Ukrainian president in 2023. So the world leader addresses a worldwide crisis. So this could be a pandemic, this could be a war, this could be famine, those sorts of things. It could be a genocide. Also helps set international policies as the leader of the free world. So this here is The president chooses global policies to support. So this is COVAX, is a World Health Organization, the WHO program to get COVID-19 vaccines to people in developing nations because they could not, they did not have the funds or the resources to develop their own vaccines. Initially, President Trump declined to participate, and then when President Biden took office, he reversed that decision and did get the United States to participate in that program. But that is setting a national policy on how we will handle world events like that. The president often meets with the members of the UN Security Council. The UN Security Council has 5 permanent members, and the U.S. is one of them. So while the president appoints an ambassador to the UN, they and other world leaders also often attend meetings, that they deem as important to their agenda. And here we see President Obama at the center of the circle. So he is in here. He is here, I should say, at the center of the circle, delivering a message to the Security Council chamber in 2009. The president also assists in negotiating agreements between other nations. So because the United States is such a world leader, the president is often involved in what seems like regional issues, like the conflict between Israel and Palestine. However, our interconnected, globalized world, there is no such thing as a regional issue anymore. They affect everyone worldwide. The level of international involvement can create conflict with Americans who feel the president's time, attention, and taxpayer dollars should be spent on problems at home. So here's Clinton, President Clinton, very much conveying a very strong role, or played a very strong role in the Oslo Accord agreement between Israel and Palestine in 1993. Trump has tried to negotiate some treaties between, he's tried to work between Palestine and Gaza, Hamas, and he's also working with between Russia and Ukraine. So very quickly on your paper, I want you to note which of these 6 roles, so chief diplomat, chief executive, commander-in-chief, head of state, head of party, and leader of the free world, should be decreased or weakened in some way. Which one do you think? So take a few minutes, pause the video, and jot that down. And then out of these 6 roles, which should be increased or strengthened in some way, and why? Make sure you give that why. Again, those roles are going to be your chief diplomat, chief executive, commander-in-chief, head of state, head of party, and leader of the free world. Okay, our final part in our roles and powers of the executive branch is going to be dealing with very specific powers of the executive branch. So we have discussed several things that the presidents can do to fulfill their roles, but there are some more very specific powers, such as sign or veto bills, grant pardons, appoint federal judges, plus some other implied powers. So let's get into it. So first, the president signs or veto bills sent by Congress, which we see in Article 1, Section 7 here. This is that actual quote from the Constitution itself. This bookends with the president's role of suggesting to Congress what bills they'd like to see Congress pass, which often is done through the State of the Union address as the president is acting as chief legislature. So this is why some people say between the State of the Union address and other ways the president proposes legislation, as well as having to then sign a bill or veto it at the end, kind of really suggests that the president can wear a hat called the chief legislator. This power is the president's check on Congress. So President Washington felt the veto power should only be used in extreme cases. Very rarely should it be to kind of further the president's personal agenda, but in the modern times, it is used way more frequently. It's used a lot more. Usually a bill signing is an elaborate event with lots of people, but as we see in this video, photo. President Trump signed the Coronavirus Preparedness and Response Supplemental Appropriations Act in early of March 2020, and he only had one person by his side. So he is also much more not in it. He's much more in a more toned down appearance. He's not in a suit and tie because we were dealing with a national emergency. Another power the president has, he shall have the power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States. So this means that basically the president can issue a pardon to forgive someone's criminal convictions. So this is a check, the president's check on the federal judiciary system to override what the president thinks or feels is a wrongful conviction. This is the perfect example of the president having extraordinary powers, but part of having great powers is not using all the power you have. So a president usually will grant pardons as they end their time in office, since they can be so controversial. And if they're controversial, that could reflect on other members of the party who might be trying to get elected in the midterm election or might be running for the election to replace that president, since, if they've termed out or chosen not to run again. So they can be for individuals or groups. So you can do amnesty or a reprieve. And then lastly, just like the 4,000 executive positions the president has to nominate for or appoint for, they also have to select federal judges when an opening opens on the federal court system. So federal judgeships are lifetime appointments, so they only become vacant when someone dies or retires. We only usually hear about it when it's a Supreme Court justice. Here we see an image of President Obama announcing his pick of Justice Merrick Garland to fill the seat that became open in early of 2016, his last year in office. What's unique about the event is that the Senate, which needs to confirm the appointment, refused to hold their confirmation hearings. The Senate has the advise and consent policy. So Garland did become a member of the Supreme Court. This confirmation was an unusual move by Congress, especially because so much time passed. Garland was later appointed Attorney General by Biden for his administration. Now, implied powers. So there are a couple of powers that the president has that are nowhere specifically stated in the Constitution, but they have come to be understood as something the president can do. But because they're outside the scope of the Constitution or the clear language of the Constitution, they are often pushed to their legal limits and oftentimes results in legal challenges. So let's look at some examples. So very quickly, we're going to look at some examples of executive orders. These act like laws. Enter into executive agreements. These act like treaties and invoke executive privilege. So the executive order power is this is the power not explicitly listed in the Constitution, but like a company's CEO. Okay, they can issue orders for the employees to follow. This is trying to give clarification on how the president wants the bureaucracy, all of the agencies and the departments, to enact this legislation. So they have the impact of the law, but there's some limitations to this. So in this image that you see here, this is the governor of Alabama. He's in the suit and tie on the left side of the screen, is trying to stop two black students from entering the auditorium here at the University of Alabama so they could register for classes. The Supreme Court case of Brown v. Board of Ed ordered schools to be desegregated nearly a decade earlier. So this is 1963, and President Kennedy issued Executive Order 1111, so 11111, to enforce this ruling. because the Supreme Court couldn't do themselves, and he was going to use federal troops to do that. So the man with the crossed arms facing Governor Wallace is Deputy U.S. Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, acting on behalf of the president. So he has sent someone out to kind of act on his behalf. Wallace is effectively refusing to comply with the order, which would technically could result in some disciplinary action. He does eventually step aside. Like laws, executive orders can be overturned by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court can say, nope, this is outside the scope of the presidential powers. And this happened to parts of Biden's vaccine mandate. So a president will issue hundreds of executive orders over an 8-year term, administration, as well as presidential proclamations, referendums, notices, memorandums. They don't usually have the same ceremony as laws, especially if it's a big major law that the president is looking to sign. And the president often just signs them in the Oval Office. So since EOs are issued so routinely, they can also be undone by the new president of the other party that enters office. So on the first day, they sign a lot of EOs, which we did see with Trump coming into office, many of which are reversing previous EOs. Executive agreements are international agreements without congressional approval. This is a huge implied power for the president. He's entering into an understanding that are not technically treaties. So originally these would be over minor things when full treaties was considered excessive. So now, though, executive agreements are used for pretty big things. Okay, so in this case, you see former Secretary of State John Kerry under President Obama. He signs the Paris Agreement, which was a commitment to tackling climate change. But because it was an executive agreement, it has similar limitations like that an executive order has. The next administration can undo that agreement, and they can withdraw us from those understandings. The issue becomes this back and forth of policy. It creates difficulty for other countries to know how to kind of work with the United States. Executive privilege is the president's effort to prohibit the release of certain information. So this is the least used power, and it's the most controversial. So when a president claims executive privilege, they're claiming their right to keep certain things confidential when other branches are requesting their release, specifically Congress. So while the Supreme Court has confirmed that the power exists in its rulings that said that the president can keep some things secret, it's best reserved for extreme national security issues. Okay, most famously, it was invoked by President Nixon to withhold records connecting the White House to the Watergate break-in. But because Nixon's team only argued for a generalized need for confidentiality and the national security issues weren't really there, the Supreme Court struck down those efforts. And that led to President Nixon resigning, which is what this image is about. All right, so that wraps up part 2, roles and powers of the executive branch. Make sure that you have completed the notes and you've filled out those questions, and I will see you next time. Bye, guys.